Japan is a hostage of its own geography and is severely lacking in natural resources. In 2021, Japan saw the biggest population drop on record. Despite what you may have heard about Japan's technological progression and the megacities within, there's issues beneath the surface that have been there for millennia now, and may pose a huge threat to this island nation's future. In total, Japan is made up of over 6,800 islands, all in varying states of habitability, populations, and a wide range of ecosystems. However, there are 4 main islands making up an area roughly the same size as the American eastern seaboard. To the north, there's the largely agricultural Hokkaido, known for its rich soil and snowy winters. To the southwest is the subtropical island of Kyushu, nicknamed the Land of Fire due to its many active volcanoes. To the south is the island of Shikoku, filled with mountains and known globally for its many ancient Buddhist temples. The heart of the country, however, is on the largest, most central island. Honshu is vast and teeming with life. The best known geographical feature here is probably Mount Fuji, the highest point in the country. This island makes Japan sound rich and filled with bountiful resources. I mean, it kind of is, but as we'll see, a mixture of increasing problems plays into Japan's resource issues. Honshu is also home to Tokyo, the world's largest metropolitan area. Tokyo itself is more than just a city. The prefecture of Tokyo actually expands far beyond the main metropolitan area. Within the prefecture area resides nearly 14 million people. That number balloons to over 36 million if we look at the entire Tokyo metropolitan area, which expands outside of the prefecture boundaries. To put that into perspective, Tokyo alone contains 12% of the entire country. Don't think of Tokyo as one huge city though. Rather, think of it as 23 small cities lumped together. These areas are called wards. These wards are treated differently than, for example, New York City does with its 5 boroughs. Tokyo's wards instead each act as their own cities within the city, with each of the 23 wards of Tokyo even having their own mayor. It's effectively a megacity like the ones we've talked about previously in this video here. Tokyo is like a focal point for Japan itself. This makes sense if we take a look at the nation's topography. The area in and around Tokyo is some of the flattest land in Japan, which also made it the easiest to develop. Instead of having to cross over or through mountains, those who originally settled around what is now Tokyo were greeted by flat, arable, easy to build on land. This also explains why Tokyo is central to the story of Japan itself. To further understand that and how this plays into the story of Japan's lack of natural resources, especially precious metals and oil reserves, we have to go back hundreds of years back to when Tokyo was known as Edo. Though now the capital, Edo would not serve that role until 1868, when the emperor relocated there. Instead, much of what was called the Edo period, which began in the 17th century, it was instead home of the Tokugawa shogunate, the then military branch of the government. During the same period, the formal capital was instead located in Kyoto. Japan's struggles with natural resources date back to a time way before even the emperor or even the Azuma Kagami chronicles in the 11th century. It can be traced to the Jomon period thousands of years ago. During this age, art and farming techniques flourished. However, the process of obtaining and refining metals was slow. And understandably, these practices first prospered in the communities that sprouted in the few plainal areas of Honshu. The region in and around Edo was not the only flat, fertile land in the country. There was also the Osaka Plain, now home to just over 19 million people, but equally surrounded on most sides by mountains. The Japanese archipelago, due to being in a subduction zone, an area where tectonic plates meet and where one slides under another, is home to a wide variety of mineral resources. However, many of these are not on the surface, but rather on the surrounding seabed. Japan's access to natural resources overwhelmingly would come not from within, but from trade with other surrounding nations. Trade was overwhelmingly with civilizations in what is now China and the Koreas. Japan was very isolationist and managed to avoid the majority of the brunt of European colonization efforts. And when I say isolationist, I mean there was a policy in feudal Japan where leaving the country or attempting unsolicited trade with another country would result in death if you ever returned. Well, until an American fleet came and did a real American move in 1868. And by real American move, I mean forced Japan to open to Western trade at gunpoint. I mean, Uncle Sam really got into the whole imperialist thing pretty badly in the late 1800s, and we've even talked about it before in a previous video. During the period between 1868 and 1912 is when mining really started to build up across Japan. With the forced opening to the west also came increase in growth and private companies in Japan, especially in regards to resource extraction. And over the next century, particularly during the build-up to World War II and the decades directly following, mines and wells would spring up across Japan, particularly offshore. Japan's lack of resources is part of what led to the genocidal imperialist era of the 1930s, where Japan conquered parts of China, the Korean peninsula, and surrounding islands. After World War II, these claimed lands were relinquished and Japan was strictly back to its mountains, offshore resources, and newly industrialized, rebuilt cities. In an attempt to encourage building up domestic projects, laws regulating industrial pollution were highly limited until around the 1970s. In coal, for example, at its peak in 1960, Japan was producing 55 million tons annually. By the 1980s though, this production had dipped to 16 million tons domestically, with over 90 million being imported annually. And in the decades since, Japan's coal reserves have rapidly diminished. And I wish I could say that the shift away from resources like coal had to do with its commitments to tackling climate change. But that's not solely the case. Indeed, much of it is due to having to handle the complex nature of world trade and wanting to become more self-sufficient in energy production. Thanks in part to the rebuilding efforts after World War II, manufacturing boomed in Japan.
Japanese are instinctively in tune with the new world of technology.
And by the 80s, technology-based industries were beginning to grow as well. With this came moves to the cities, particularly Tokyo, and many of the small towns, particularly farm towns, began to literally dry up. A great example of this is Hashima Island, located off Nagasaki, nicknamed Battleship Island. The island was first settled in the late 1800s, a site for undersea coal mining. At its peak in 1959, just over 5,200 people lived on the island. In 1974, when Japan was rapidly shifting away from coal power, the Mitsubishi company, who owned the entire island, decided to shut down the mines and forced all inhabitants to leave. And with that shift away from coal came an increase in imports. Infamously, Japan has had highly limited oil and natural gas reserves. Battleship Island is an extreme example, but it is also representative of some of the changes in economic focus and population that have occurred in Japan over the past 60 years. In 1960, just over 60% of Japanese people resided in urban areas. As of 2022, that number is 92%. Throughout the late 20th century, Japan began to rapidly modernize. High-speed railways were built, Western ideas of nuclear family came in via media and blended with traditional Japanese idea of family. And by the end of the 80s, the Japanese stock market was reaching new heights and the housing market was soaring. And then, in 1991, it all collapsed.
1990 saw the key Nikkei index in Tokyo suffer heavy losses, and now there are growing concerns that Tokyo's real estate market may be next.
This crash would reverberate throughout Japanese society throughout the next 30 years. It was so severe that the 1990s earned the nickname the Lost Decade. While Japan, since the 90s, has rebuilt, more and more companies domestically have moved away from resource extraction and more towards technology-focused industries. This has had its own set of effects, for better or worse. In 2018, free trade agreements were signed with the EU, and in 2020, a similar agreement was signed with the UK. Japan has also invested heavily in education, though most families that have children only have a single child. In 2022, there were around 7 babies born for every 1,000 people in Japan, compared to 25 per 1,000 in 1950. With a population that is on the whole aging, and with fewer babies being born year after year, it's expected that Japan's population will potentially enter into full-on population collapse in the coming decades. deaths outpaced births for the first time starting in 2011. And in 2021, Tokyo saw its first ever decline in population. It's expected that the population from Japan will likely decline from the current nearly 126 million to just under 97 million in 2050. If this keeps on track, that means that the population will be halved by 2100. A dwindling population means fewer people to help obtain domestic resources. Resources already made difficult to obtain by Japan's geography. And that's not to mention Japan itself exists in somewhat of a precarious position, with a lot of trade being reliant on China and the United States. Even with the shrinking population, Japan has a huge number of people it needs to provide food and power to. For a while, it tried to offset this through nuclear power. A quarter of the country's power came from nuclear sources in 2010. Japan is also surrounded by fault lines. This puts it at the mercy of earthquakes, and the devastation that these quakes can cause cannot be understated. An earthquake and resulting tsunami in 2011 led to the horrific Fukushima nuclear disaster, in which the power plant in Okuma went into full-on nuclear meltdown. The environmental impact alone is on par with the Chernobyl disaster in Ukraine, and has led to a shift away from nuclear power. This puts Japan even further at the mercy of fossil fuel imports. Japan is not just seeing a population implosion, Japan is seemingly trapped by its geography. Barely 10% of Japan is suitable for growing crops, and its ability to support its population is getting more and more difficult over time. But with mountainous terrain making resource extraction difficult, international tensions, particularly with China, potentially making trade harder in the upcoming decades, and many of the remaining natural resources being offshore, whether or not Japan can remain one of the world's most prosperous economies and can eventually become self-sufficient is to be seen. Japan's geography has given peace and isolation from other powers historically, but has also limited its ability to grow and provide for its people. Put simply, Japan is stuck between some mountains and a hard place.